I was 14 the first time I felt something was off. Until then, our neighborhood seemed untouchable, safe in the way you only believe when you're a kid. It was the kind of place where you could leave your bike in the yard overnight and find it leaning against the fence the next morning. Exactly where you left it. We lived in a modest subdivision on the edge of a sleepy Midwestern town. The houses looked like clones of each other. Same siding, same porches, same squeaky mailboxes that always needed oiling. In the summers, the cul-de-sacs bloomed with chalk drawings and the echo of kids' laughter. Everyone knew each other just enough to nod, wave, and pass along a plate of cookies at Christmas. Not friends, not family, just familiar. My parents, Daniel and Marissa, weren't the type to host cookouts or linger at block parties. They valued privacy, and honestly, so did I. If anyone had told me back then that one of those waving neighbors would nearly dismantle our lives, I'd have laughed it off. That kind of danger belonged in late-night thrillers, not on our street. But I learned quick how wrong I was. It started small, so small I almost brushed it off. His name was Greg Turner, or at least that's what the black stenciled letters on his rusty mailbox said. He was in his late 40s, gray creeping into a wiry beard, the type who wore work boots with his jeans even on Sundays. His house was 2 doors down, tucked behind a yard that looked like it hadn't been cared for in years. My mom said he'd been around longer than anyone, always keeping to himself, which in her language meant he was odd. The first real confrontation came over a garden hose. It was June, one of those days where the heat pressed down so hard your shirt glued itself to your back. My dad was crouched in the front yard, fixing the spigot, sweat dripping into his collar. When Greg came stomping across the street, he moved like someone who'd been rehearsing the argument all morning. His face was blotchy red, his eyes wide and glassy like whatever fury he carried had nowhere to go but out. "You people think you own the whole damn block, huh?" he barked, stopping at the edge of our driveway. My dad straightened slowly, wrench still in his hand. "Can I help you with something?" "Yeah, you can stop stealing my water." Dad blinked. "Excuse me?" Greg jabbed a thick finger toward the narrow strip of grass between our houses. "That hose of yours spraying on my side like you're trying to flood me out. Don't think I didn't notice." "It was an accident," Dad said, voice calm but tight. "The wind must have blown it." "Accident," Greg repeated, letting out a laugh with no warmth in it. "Right. You people think you can waste water like it's nothing. Some of us pay attention to the rules." I stood near the garage, a soda can sweating in my hand, trying to shrink into the siding. Something in the way Greg's eyes locked on my dad. Like he was memorizing every detail of his face, storing it away for later, made my stomach knot. "We'll make sure it doesn't happen again," Dad said, firmer now. "Have a nice day." Greg lingered a beat too long. Then, without breaking eye contact, he spat on our driveway and turned back toward his house. I thought that was the end of it, just a bitter man blowing off steam. But a week later, I stepped outside and nearly sank into the yard. The grass was drenched, puddles glistening in the sunlight, water squelching under my sneakers like a sponge. Our hose had been dragged across the lawn, left running at full blast for hours. Mom was furious. She called the water district when the bill showed a sharp spike. That's when she found out Greg had been slapped with a fine that very same day, for water misuse. That was the moment I realized this wasn't over. It was just beginning. The first time Greg came to the house, I was on the couch half watching some dumb sitcom, legs tucked under a blanket. The front door opened and Mom was smiling at whoever was on the porch. And then I saw him, sprinting across the street like he'd been pulled by a string. Sweat clung to his shirt, eyes too wide, hair plastered to his forehead. "Marissa!" he boomed as if they'd been at bridge club together. "Great to see you. Hey, no hard feelings about that little water mix-up, right?" From where I sat, I watched my mother's smile stiffen until it looked lacquered. "Greg, now's not a good time," she said, voice thin. He cut her off, leaning on the doorframe like he owned the threshold. "You know what's funny?" he said, grinning while his face went a shade too red. "Your husband works for the water district, doesn't he?" "Saw it on the registry. Small world, huh?" My stomach dropped. That wasn't a question. It was a statement, one meant to remind us he knew things. "Please leave, Greg," Mom said louder. For a flicker of a second, his grin fell away and something colder slid into his eyes. Then he chuckled low and humorless. "Sure," he said. "But this isn't over. Not by a long shot." He turned and walked away, and for the first time I watched fear settle into my mother's face like a physical thing. After that, Greg was everywhere. At first it read like coincidence, running into him at the supermarket, at the DMV, at the gas station while we pumped our tank. But the coincidences all began to look choreographed. He'd hang back by the carts, pretend to be on the phone, and his head would tilt toward us every few seconds, like a shark circling. He left murmurs that were meant to be overheard. "Nice family you got there," or "Bet your dad loves his job, huh?" Little seeds planted where they could grow. Then the calls started. Late at night, the landline would ring, and when someone picked up, there was nothing but breathing. Slow, deliberate, inches from the receiver, or a thread of whispering so faint my ears strained and I still couldn't make out a single word. Dad phoned the police, but the patrolman's voice had the flatness of routine. "We can't do much without proof," he said. "Keep a log." Proof unfortunately arrived sooner than I wanted. One night, Claire and her boyfriend were cutting across the front lawn, laughing when a pair of headlights washed over them and a car swerved up the curb. Tires screamed. The vehicle barreled toward them. They hit the flower bed and dove into the shrubs as the car fishtailed past and peeled away, mud splattering its undercarriage. From the way my sister's hands were shaking, I knew her breath had stopped for a second. The next day, Mom saw the smear of blue paint on the curb and later recognized the car from the neighborhood. Greg's old blue sedan, its plate trailing mud. Mom wanted to leave that very night. Pack up and go somewhere nobody knew our name. Dad argued we couldn't run every time someone tried to scare us, but even he started double-checking the deadbolt and flicking on the porch light like a bad dream could be warded off by a switch. And Greg escalated. He began parking across from our house most nights, from 6 in the evening until 4 in the morning, sitting in that car like it was a stakeout out of a movie. Sometimes he blared music at impossible volumes. Sometimes he didn't play anything at all and you could only feel the stare through the glass. Once when I was walking the dog at dusk, he rolled his window down and made a gesture so filthy and deliberate, it flushed my cheeks hot and left me shaking. I ran all the way home and didn't stop until I was inside the kitchen, where Mom wrapped me in her arms and asked what happened. We called the police again. The answer was the same. Until he lays a hand on someone, there's little they can do. So we did what the officer said. We waited and wrote down times and dates and descriptions and felt more and more like prisoners of routine. Christmas arrived like an act of cruelty. Mom was still fragile from the aneurysm she'd barely survived. The living room felt like a hospital wing most days. Soft voices, measured steps. Then came a knock. A scruffy man stood on the porch holding a grocery store gift bag with a sheepish smile. "Got a present for the family," he said, and wouldn't tell us who it was from. Inside the bag was a 17-page legal packet, typewritten pages filled with made-up accusations, threats and misspellings that made my skin crawl. Page after page of nonsense that, if it weren't so menacing, would have been absurd. The care with which he'd printed it, stapled it, and delivered it as if it were a holiday card made it worse. That wasn't the heat of anger. That was the slow, patient architecture of obsession. And in the quiet that followed, we all understood without saying it, that he wasn't going to stop. I hadn't thought much about the street I was moving to. It was the sort of quiet cul-de-sac you see in small Midlands towns, a row of identical terraces where evenings seemed to fold in on themselves, and nothing much ever happened. The houses were twins, 2 up, 2 down, red brick fronts, back gardens so small they felt decorative, each fenced off with panels that sagged like old men set in a stubborn habit. Not glamorous, practical, cheap. After years of flat shares and endless compromises, I wanted a place that was mine, even if mine meant charity shop furniture and a kettle that kicked at odd times. The house had character. That's another way of saying it had problems. Floorboards creaked under every step. The front door would pinch shut after rain and take a minute to give. And the bathroom tiles were the kind that made winter feel like a small assault on the feet. So cold you could feel them borrow heat from your bones. Still, I didn't care much. I was 23 on my first solo tenancy, and there was a simple pleasure in turning a key and knowing everything inside belonged to me. When I signed the papers, the letting agent glanced at the attic and warned me in the same breath as the boiler check. "No proper storage up there, love," she said. "More of a crawl space than an attic. Not boarded. Don't go sticking your head in without a mask and the dust'll choke you." I nodded absently. Who needs an attic, I thought. These terraces were built in an era that prized economy over insulation. I later learned there used to be one long, shared loft running the whole row. After a couple of fires and some audacious thieves who slipped through roof voids, they built brick partitions between houses. That was Mr. Henderson's version. The way he told it on my second week when he leaned on his gate and turned every memory into a lecture. He'd lived there 40 years and had the kind of voice that made history sound like a joke. Even with walls up, he chuckled. You'd be surprised what travels along those roofs. Sound carries, always has. I laughed politely the way you do when a stranger insists the neighborhood has a personality. If I'd known then what was coming, I might have moved that night. About 2 months in, I started to notice the sounds. At first, it was those small, easy noises that old houses make. Settling pipes, a pigeon finding a place to sleep. But there was another sound, a rhythm under the joists above the bathroom. A scuffle, a scrape, a weight shifting. It always happened when I was in there, which made it ridiculous to tell anyone. One Saturday morning, toothpaste foam in my mouth, I froze mid-brush. Shh. Pause. Thud. The cadence was too deliberate to be the wind. I remember whispering to myself like some lunatic, "What the hell is that?" The next day I got Liam to go up and have a look. Liam, who treats every problem like a project and carries a torch for emergencies. He clambered into the low space with a torch and a swagger, and poked his head back down after a minute. Hair dusted white with insulation. Couple of dead spiders, a bit of blown insulation, he said, waving crumbs from his hand like a man dismissing evidence. You're fine. I wanted to believe him, and for a while I did. The house went back to being only a house. I had Diesel then, a big, placid mongrel who thought life was best served from the sofa. 3 weeks later, he changed in a single night. I'd just stepped from the shower when he started. A low, deep growl that slid under the air like something in a film. The growl became barking, urgent and wrong. The sort of bark that knifes your stomach because it expects danger. "Diesel, enough!" I snapped, heart thudding, and opened the front door, half sure someone had forced their way in. There was no one. Diesel wasn't looking at the street. He was fixed on the ceiling above the hallway, hackles up, head tilted. A thin cold spread through me, the kind that is less temperature and more attention. At that exact second, above our heads, it began again. Shh. Pause. Thud. Slow. Deliberate. Right there. I grabbed my clothes without thinking, and 5 minutes later, I was in my car, hair still damp, Diesel whining in the back while I drove to Hannah's flat across town because I just could not be in that house another second. The next morning, I tried to be reasonable with myself. Pipes, I told myself. Stress. Diesel must have smelled a rat. I even messaged Hannah, half laughing. Think I'm losing the plot, lol. That afternoon, I stood watering the sorry strip of garden while the hose sputtered, and someone called over the fence. "Settling in all right then?" said Gary from 2 doors down. Mid-40s, hair forever greased back, a grin that sat wrong on his face. He leaned on his gate like he owned the pavement and the sun, and for a moment I thought about the simple, quiet things a neighborhood offers. Small talk, cups of sugar, helpful smiles. But there was an edge to his smile that made my mouth go dry, and as I straightened, the memory of the sound in the roof returned like a small, patient thing waiting to be noticed. He had that look. The sort of bloke you don't want knowing anything private about you. "Yeah," I said, keeping my voice light and polite, because that's what you do when a man leans on your fence like he owns the boundary line and looks at you in a way that makes your shoulders hitch. He folded his arms, eyes flicking over my coat, the hose, the sagging fence, like he was cataloging details he could use later. "You were out late last night, weren't you? Make it to your mate's place all right?" he asked, like it was casual curiosity. Like he was checking up on a neighbor rather than anchoring into something he'd heard. My hand went dead on the watering can. I hadn't told anyone where I'd been. The only time I'd said the name of the bar was in a hushed whisper to Hannah, while we both hid in the bathroom with the door shut because the sound seemed louder when the ceiling thrummed above us. My throat tightened. "Sorry?" I managed. He smirked, a slow, knowing curl. "Heard you talking about it. Thin walls, eh?" His tone implied he'd heard more than that, and his grin widened in a way that made my stomach drop. But the walls weren't thin. I knew how sound moved through that house. I'd blasted music at midnight with no complaints, the whole street would rattle. This thing wasn't leaking from the next room. It was coming from directly above me. That night I phoned my dad. He's the old school type, practical, not into fuss. No time for what he calls flapping. When I told him what Gary had said, there was a long silence on the line. The kind that's not about disbelief, but about someone rearranging a mental plan. "I'm coming over," he said finally. An hour later, he arrived with two of my cousins, big lads who earned their hands on cars and never seemed impressed by much. Dad clapped his palms like it was a job to be done. "Show me where you hear it," he said. I led them to the bathroom, feeling foolish but oddly buoyed. Strength in numbers, right? We switched the light on and stared up. At first it looked ordinary. White paint, a bit of peeling near the vent, the shadow where the joists met. Then one cousin hissed and muttered, "Jesus, look." I followed his finger and found two tiny metallic glints above the shower. Not paint, not reflections from a bulb. Holes. Small enough to miss if you weren't looking, but real. Dark pinpricks that let you peer into a blackness that shouldn't have been there. My stomach dropped the way it does when you miss a step. Hot and cold washed through me together. Dad didn't waste a second. He threw the attic hatch open and hauled himself into the cramped space, torch clamped between his teeth like something out of a film. Time slowed, 5 minutes 10. I was counting when he dropped back down, his face thunder gray. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Dad stormed out and banged on Gary's door so hard I flinched at the sound. "Oi, Gary! Get out here!" he shouted. There was no answer. Cousin number 2 went up after him. He came down paler than when he'd gone in. "The wall between your attic and his," he said quietly, like telling us a private shame. "It's smashed in. Bricks everywhere." From his side, not yours. The words were small, but they landed heavy. Someone had forced entry through the partition, through the space that used to be one long shared loft and which, after the fires and the burglaries, had been bricked off. We called the police. They turned up, took our statements, waved little torches like props. Gary denied everything, blamed a previous tenant, said he'd never used the attic. There were no cameras, no prints, no clear evidence to hang it on. Just smashed bricks in those tiny holes directly over my shower. The officers looked sympathetic but helpless. There's only so much the law can do when the trace has been wiped clean or never existed. I didn't sleep another night in that house. I stuffed my clothes into bin bags and moved in with Dad until I could find somewhere else. I told myself I'd done the right thing. That distance would make it feel smaller. But years later, sometimes I still get that hitch in my chest. The sense of weight overhead, of slow, patient listening. And the worst of it is I never learned how long it had been happening. What had crept along those beams before I noticed. What had been watching through those holes while I showered. While I whispered to Hannah. While I pretended the house was only an old house with a few quirks. I woke that morning imagining it would be one of those ordinary, forgettable days at Willow Pine. Places you grow up in have a way of seducing you into complacency. You stop watching for danger because familiarity feels like a shield. I'd been at that complex since I was 5. The same cream-colored blocks, the same crazed, cracked parking lot asphalt. The same handful of faces you pass 100 times and never really know. Everyone knew everyone's outlines, at least. The Patel family in Building C blasted bass on Saturdays. Mr. Howard walked his German Shepherd at the same time every morning. His watch and the dog were in perfect sync. The Parkers on my floor had 2 children who left bright chalk constellations across the sidewalk. Their drawings faded and returned like tide marks. Life there was routine and small and steady. I felt safe. Then there was apartment D8, out in the complex's forgotten corner. The one unit that didn't fit in the picture postcard. Blinds forever closed. No plants, no pumpkins in autumn, no wreath at Christmas. 2 middle-aged brothers lived inside, quiet as paper, nodders instead of talkers. Most people barely registered them. Then the summer after my 21st birthday, something shifted. It began tiny. A new face coming and going from D8. A younger man, maybe my age. At first I assumed he was family. A cousin, a nephew. A guest who would vanish after a week. He didn't. The way he moved was wrong for our neighborhood. He never parked out front. He rarely used doors. I'd see him jogging across the lot in a hoodie in 90-degree heat, as if sweating were nothing, as if he wanted to disappear. Sometimes he climbed through the ground floor window of D8, like slipping into a building was as ordinary as crossing a threshold. I barely noticed at first. College and my shift at the bookstore kept my head full. But when I did see him, something about him tightened my chest. That hood never came down. Sunlight hit him and the fabric clung like a shadow. I could never make out his face. One night after an evening with Tyler, I was halfway up the stairs to our second-floor apartment when I stopped. He was sitting at the top landing, hood up, head tilted forward, motionless as a statue. I hesitated. Maybe he lived upstairs now, I thought. But his unit was the opposite corner. He had no reason to be there. I offered a small automatic nod. "Hey," I said. He didn't move. No glance, no hello. Just his eyes on the floor. If his face existed under that hood at all. I told myself maybe he was sick, waiting for someone. That made the moment smaller. Then it happened every day for a week. Same perch, same posture. At 9 in the morning when I left for class, he was there. When I came home at night, he was still there. One night, Tyler walked me to my door. "Does that guy seem weird to you?" I asked. Tyler glanced up the stairwell, then back at me. "Yeah," he said. "Why is he sitting there? He doesn't even live up here." "I don't know," I whispered. "It's creeping me out. Want me to say something?" He offered. "Not yet." "Maybe he's depressed or waiting for someone," I said, though I wasn't convinced. Tyler began walking me up the stairs every night after that, an unspoken watch. Then, as if someone had flipped a switch, the man stopped appearing at the landing. Relief was immediate and shallow. A week later, after evening class, I got off the bus and froze. There he was at the bus stop, hood up, just standing, waiting like he'd been waiting my whole life. My stomach dropped. I started toward the complex. He started to walk behind me, close enough that I could feel the tempo of his steps matching mine, and closer still. Not close enough to touch, but close enough that I could hear his shoes scuffing against the pavement. A soft, hollow sound that put my teeth on edge. I told myself I was being dramatic, that I was reading a pattern where there was none, that maybe he was simply going the same way as me. But then it happened again the next day and the next. After a few more times, I stopped convincing myself and started feeling a steady, rising heat of dread every time I stepped off that bus, as if my skin remembered what my brain could not yet name. He'd be there. When I told Mom, she folded in on herself like a spring tightening. Her hand landed on the countertop so hard a coaster jumped. "We're telling your dad," she said. "And the neighbors." By morning, half the building knew. Mrs. Garcia from 2B began, appearing by the lobby like clockwork. Mr. Patel, who usually only emerged for weekend barbecues, offered to walk me in if he saw me by myself. People watched the stairwells. They watched the parking lot. Their looks were soft, protective things, and for a moment I felt less naked in the world. Still, it didn't stop him. The night that changed everything arrived without fanfare. It was past midnight. Rain had been threatening all evening, and the air smelled wet and metallic, as if the world itself had been washed and set out to dry. Streetlights hummed above in their orange halos, and shadows pooled deeper than usual. I'd been at Tyler's and came home slow, the way you do when you have nothing urgent to rush toward. I kicked off my shoes at the door, drooped toward my room, and then froze when I heard Mom call. "Laya," she whispered from the kitchen. "Come here." There was a tremor in her voice that made the hair on my arms stand to attention. I moved toward her like someone walking through fog. "What is it?" I asked, stupid because my throat felt full. She didn't answer for a second, just pointed at the big living room window that faced the old oak out front. At first, my eyes refused to find anything. Then my pupils widened and the porch light outlined a silhouette. Someone was sitting in the tree, hood up, knees hugged to their chest, face angled toward our window. My stomach dropped so hard I thought I might be sick. "It's him," Mom said, voice tiny and flat. I couldn't move. Breath came in short, surprised bursts, then with a deliberate slowness that made me feel like I'd been dropped in the middle of a film. He turned his head as if he'd known we were watching. That motion cracked whatever numb spell I'd been under. I screamed for Dad. He came pounding down the hall, eyes wide, and barreled for the door. The man in the tree didn't wait. He dropped in a single, fluid motion, and was gone into the black before Dad even reached the stoop. We called 911. The officers combed the tree and pulled out things that still make my skin crawl when I think of them. A thin, grubby blanket, empty snack wrappers, an old dented water bottle. Evidence of someone who hadn't simply perched there for a night but had been living above us, watching. How long had he been up there? Nights, weeks? The question sat heavy and raw. That was 6 months ago. The police took our statements and said they would patrol, watch the area. No one's seen him since. One of the older brothers still lives in D8 and goes about his life like nothing happened. The younger man vanished. Time goes on, or at least I tell myself it does. But each time I pass the oak, my chest tightens. Each time I sit by that window, the same small, stubborn terror returns. How many nights had he watched from those branches? How many times had I walked beneath him, ignorant? I don't want to know. More than anything, I hope I never see him again. I moved to the UK a couple of years ago because home had stopped feeling like home. Things had got so tense between me and my parents that even the silence at their house felt suffocating. University felt like my ticket out, and in that first year it was exactly what I needed. Freedom, late walks with friends, tiny kitchen parties in halls where someone always burned toast. For the first time in ages, I could breathe. By second year, I wanted an upgrade. No more cramped flat with walls so thin I could hear someone whispering 3 doors down. A few friends and I decided to rent a proper student house. 2 floors, a tiny living room, and a backyard barely big enough for 2 chairs and an ashtray. It wasn't much, but it was ours. I took the ground floor room. Not the biggest, but it had a window onto the yard and its own back door. Perfect for a smoke when the others didn't want the smell inside. At the end of the yard stood an old, wooden gate, paint peeling, warped from rain. It led into one of those narrow alleys every terrace shares for bin access. The latch was broken, so we looped string tight around the handles and called it secure. Janky, yeah, but it worked. The street was mostly students like us with a couple of small families. We were sandwiched between 2 other rentals. On the left, a group of girls we'd met in first year. On the right, 5 men, older, late 20s, maybe pushing 30. They didn't look like students. Tattoos crawling up necks, tracksuits, that restless, nervous energy you feel before you even make eye contact. We didn't know their names and, honestly, we pretended not to care. The first weeks were fine. Loud music sometimes, shouting when football was on. Nothing we couldn't live with. Then one night everything changed. Around midnight I heard sirens, distant at first, then closer until blue light streaked across my ceiling. I peered through the blinds, heart jackhammering, and watched 2 police cars pull up outside the house next door. The front door flew open and one of the men stumbled out, his shirt soaked. For a second I thought it was mud. Then he tilted his arm and I saw blood, dark and glistening, trickling from a deep gash near his elbow. Me and my housemate stood by the window, frozen. He was shouting, words tumbling, voice ragged. 2 cops grabbed him and sat him on the curb, others rushed inside. The injured man kept muttering half-sentences, eyes all over the place. Jesus, Jess breathed behind me. What the hell happened? Andy. Hour later, when an ambulance arrived, one of the girls from next door came over to explain. Apparently, one of the guys had gone off his head, attacked the others, and tried to set part of the kitchen alight. When it calmed, the police led one man away in cuffs. The injured man, tall, shaved head, dark stubble, stayed outside, hunched, on their steps with his hands pressed against a bandaged arm. That's when I made the mistake of opening our back door. "You all right?" I called, stepping out a little so I didn't look confrontational. He looked up. His eyes were glassy and unfocused, like someone who'd been drinking, but too sharp to be totally gone. "Yeah," he slurred. Just a scratch." "It doesn't look like just a scratch," I said. Blood had already soaked through the bandage. I called Jess for a clean shirt. While we waited, he rose slowly, swaying, and gave me a smile that tugged something cold through my stomach. "You're sweet," he said in a low voice. "Didn't think anyone round here cared." I forced a laugh, crossing my arms. "Mate, you look like you need a clean top, that's all." When Jess handed him a shirt, he changed right there on the step, peeling off the blood-sodden top without a blink. His chest was a map of tattoos, black ink crawling up ribs, lettering I couldn't read. He rambled about fake people and trust. Then his tone slid. "You live there?" he asked, nodding at our door. "Yeah," I answered before thinking. His smile widened. "Nice ground floor." "Yeah," I said again. His eyes flicked to my window and something cold clenched my gut. Jess picked it up too and cut in. "We should go. Take care of yourself, all right?" We went back inside and locked the door. I tried to tell myself later he was high, messed up, harmless. But things started to feel off from that night. Small, sour edges to everyday life. I'd see him on the street sometimes, alone, grinning in a way that felt private. Once he followed me to the shop, staying just far enough behind to look accidental and close enough that my skin tightened. I started locking the window every night, leaving a light on, checking the latch. When I tried to brush him off, he called after me, too cheerful for the moment. "I'll wait outside your house. Yeah, we'll have a proper chat." I laughed then, forced and brittle, and told myself he was joking. I wasn't laughing the day I turned onto our street and saw him and one of his mates lounging on our doorstep, as if they owned the place. They were sitting like cushions for themselves, elbows on knees, cigarette smoke curling. My stomach dropped so hard I thought I'd be sick. I ducked behind a parked car and fumbled my phone, fingers shaking too much to type. I rang Mark, the only bloke of the lot who might actually answer in a crisis, straight to voicemail. "Jess? Chloe?" Nothing. I hung around near the corner, shop for nearly an hour, pacing, watching the time crawl like something with a limp. Every passing car felt like it might be them coming closer. When I finally walked back, throat so tight I could barely swallow, the step was empty. The metal of the front door felt colder than it should as I slammed it closed and shoved a chair under the back handle that night, ridiculous and solemn all at once. I started checking bolts twice, thrumming with that small animal alertness that makes your palms sweat. It escalated. A few weeks later, I went out for a cigarette and found the yard gate wide open. The thin string we'd looped around the handles, the janky thing that had felt somehow safe when was gone. Not untied, but cleanly cut. For a second, I told myself Mark must have taken the bins out and simply forgotten to tie it back. When I asked, he swore up and down he hadn't touched it. No one had. Life next door turned uglier. Arguments that sounded like animal fights, things smashing, voices that dropped into low, dangerous growls. Sometimes I'd wake at 3 a.m. to them tearing the place apart. Whatever the police had cleared out that first night seemed to pool into another kind of violence. At first I wanted to call every time, but then I remembered the look on Adrian's face that night and the glassy danger, and I froze. I told myself it would pass. The night everything snapped, Ryan was staying over. We dozed off watching a terrible horror film, his arm thrown across me, the room warm and sticky. I woke to his shaking me. "Em," he whispered, "wake up." He sounded small, like something inside him was frightened. "What?" I breathed. "Shh." He put a finger to his lips. We listened. At first nothing, only the clock and our own breathing. Then, crunch, gravel underfoot. It was disturbingly ordinary. Brian slid out of bed, slow for stealth, and my hand found my phone, the screen blinding in the dark. A dull thud. The gate creaked long and low, the sound of someone easing it open. Ryan mouthed, "Call the police." Before I could move the handle, rattled, not a frantic assault but a patient test. Once, twice again. Whoever it was wasn't panicked. They were deliberate, ticking off time. Then a whisper pushed against the door, muffled but clear enough to plant ice in my chest. "Here, here." Ryan grabbed my arm, eyes wide and white. My breath stuttered. Then the window, our window, left cracked because the room trapped heat, made a soft protesting groan as someone pushed against the frame. The gap widened, imperceptible at first, then bigger, like a mouth opening. A voice murmured something, in a language I didn't know. Another chuckled, low and casual, as if this were a joke. That sound, laughter beside footsteps on our gravel, cut through me. I dragged Ryan with me, grabbed only phones, no shoes, and we hurtled down the hall, through the front door and onto the street with cold air slapping at our faces. I called the others, words spilling out. "Lock your doors, don't open for anyone." Then 999, my voice trembling so much the operator made me repeat street names. Police arrived fast, boots thudding and lights painting the terrace blue. They swept the yard and alley. They found Adrian crouched in a neighbor's shed, shaking, hands bloody. Another was picked up a street over, leaning against a lamppost, lighting a joint like he hadn't a care. Inside their house, officers pulled out heroin pill bags and a kitchen knife so large it made my stomach flip when they held it up in an evidence bag. One officer told us quietly that they'd been planning to sort something out with us. I didn't want to know what that meant. Adrian got 2 years for intent to harm with a weapon. The rest scattered, some disappearing into the city's thin summer-like shadows. I moved out before the semester finished. I couldn't stay after feeling that frame shift under invisible hands, after the whispering through the door. Months later, I still wake at every creak. I can't pass a half-open gate without my chest tightening, and sometimes, when sleep is shallow, I swear I hear it again. Slow, patient footsteps on gravel just outside the window. I thought that summer would be perfect. The kind of season you dream about as a kid. Endless days stretched wide open, warm nights humming with crickets, the air sticky with freedom. No homework, no teachers, just ice cream trucks singing through the streets, late-night movies flickering on living room walls, and the promise of staying outside until your skin smelled like grass and sun. That year, my parents worked longer hours than usual, so most weekends my brother and I ended up at Grandma's place in Willow Creek. It was the kind of small town where every stranger somehow knew your name. Her house sat on a corner lot wrapped in chain-link fencing, with a backyard that felt like its own little universe. Patches of stubborn grass, a creaking swing set half swallowed by rust, and enough space for us to run until our lungs burned. On the hottest days, Grandma dragged out this faded blue inflatable pool. It wasn't anything special, just deep enough for a handful of kids to splash around. But for us, it might as well have been a private water park. That Saturday, the sun was merciless, the pavement shimmering like glass, the kind of heat that pinned you down until the only escape was water. Grandma set out her usual lawn chairs and a sweating pitcher of lemonade. Her white sun hat tilted low over her face. It was me, my brother Ethan, and our cousins Lily and Noah. We were soaked through, shrieking with laughter, making up stupid games, smacking each other with waves until our fingertips wrinkled into raisins. Everything about it felt untouchable, safe, ordinary, the kind of memory you think will last forever. If only I had known. The first time I saw him that day, he was leaning against the wooden fence at the edge of the yard, half shadowed in sunlight. I'd noticed him before, always from a distance. He lived in the gray house next door, the one with peeling paint and a yard swallowed up by weeds. He was older, maybe 15 or 16, all lanky limbs and sun-bleached hair that hung into his eyes. He had that casual swagger older kids wore like armor, like the world was just waiting for them to take it. Ethan spotted him first. "Yo, Connor," he called, grinning wide. "You just gonna stand there creeping or you gonna get in?" Connor smirked. "You inviting me?" "Yeah, why not? Ask Grandma, though." I expected her to say no. She didn't know him well, and Grandma had rules about strays, as she called them. But when Ethan asked, she barely glanced up from her magazine. "As long as everyone behaves and keeps the water outside my house," she said with a wave, before disappearing back inside. That was all Connor needed. He swung himself over the fence in one quick motion, landing barefoot in our little sanctuary like he'd always belonged there. At first it wasn't bad. He cracked jokes, splashed too hard, made us laugh. Ethan thought he was the coolest guy alive. Lily's eyes kept following him like he was some movie star who had stumbled into her backyard. Noah was quiet, watching the whole scene with his usual blank stare. Me, I was clumsy, awkward, trying too hard. I laughed at the right moment, smiled just enough, prayed my nerves weren't showing. I didn't realize that in less than an hour I'd feel like I was trapped underwater, gasping for air I couldn't find. It started when everyone else went inside. Ethan and my cousins volunteered to help Grandma with snacks, racing toward the kitchen in dripping towels. I told them I'd stay out, that I didn't feel like drying off yet. Really, I just needed a few minutes where no one was watching me. Connor stayed behind too. "You don't like chips or something?" he asked, lounging by the pool's edge, his smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I'm good," I muttered, trying to keep my voice steady. For a moment, silence stretched between us, the cicadas droning in the distance, water plinking rhythmically off the vinyl pool. sunlight burning hot against my skin. Then Connor tilted his head, his voice low, teasing but sharp enough to sting. "You're kinda quiet, huh? Bet you're the boring one in your family." I laughed it off, though my stomach nodded. "Guess that makes two of us, then," I said, trying to sound casual. He flashed that lazy grin. "Nah, I'm not boring. You just can't keep up." It escalated. He started splashing me harder, sharp blows of water that hit like slaps. I splashed back, pretending, but he wouldn't slow. The water kept stinging my face until I had to turn to breathe. "Connor, stop," I told him, laughing too loud to hide how tight my chest felt. He didn't. When I said it again, serious, he paused. I hoped he'd back off. Instead, he reached for a big plastic bucket by the pool. Before I could move, he filled it and slammed it over my head. Cold air vanished. I remember only panic. He shoved me down and held me there. I thrashed, kicked, scratched. He weighed me down so I couldn't leverage free. My lungs burned. My heartbeat drowned out everything. For a second, I thought, this is it. I'm going to black out. Then he let go. I shot up, coughing, gasping like air was the only thing keeping me alive. Tears and water blurred everything. "What the hell is wrong with you?" Ethan's voice was raw. He stood between us, fists clenched. Connor put his hands up like it was nothing. "Relax, dude. We were just playing." "That's not playing," Ethan said. "You could have killed her." Connor shrugged, the smirk back in its place. "She's fine." "Stop being dramatic. Get out," Ethan snapped, voice low and shaking. "Get the hell out of here." Connor muttered something, an annoyed joke about how boring we were, climbed the fence and walked away. I sat shivering, water dripping off me into the grass. My chest ached, my head throbbed, and neither of us told Grandma right away. Maybe because the story felt too ridiculous to be true. Maybe because the words, "he held me under," would sound like I was overreacting. Maybe because I was ashamed of how small I'd felt. But Connor didn't drop it. Over the next weeks, he appeared more often at the fence, timing his standing there so I'd notice. Sometimes he'd whistle or call my name in a way that made my skin crawl. Other times he'd say things that didn't land as jokes. Comments that left a sour taste, like he was testing how far he could push me. Once he came with a friend. They stood together, laughing at stuff I couldn't hear, looking at us like we were an exhibit behind glass. Finally, it escalated to the point Ethan couldn't ignore. He told our parents, then Grandma. When adults confronted Connor, he played the innocent kid, charming maybe, or practiced, saying we'd made it up and it was all harmless fun. But his eyes didn't match the act. They were flat, unrepentant, and the way he looked at me made something cold settle in my chest. Then, as suddenly as he'd arrived, his family moved. The aftermath felt strange and unreal. People moved through the yard, Grandma wiping plates, Ethan pacing while I sat replaying each second like a scratched record. I kept waiting for someone to name it, to say the words that would make it stop sounding ridiculous. "He held you under." But the sentence never came. The silence filled the space instead, as if naming it would shatter something. At school, Connor passed by sometimes with that same loose swagger, eyes skimming me as if judging whether I was entertaining. I learned to make myself small, to keep my head down so he wouldn't choose me again. My cousins drifted away from the pool the next summer without explanation. Other kids sensed things without speaking. Ethan became quieter but more watchful. There was a new edge to him. Once, catching me staring out the window, he said, "I should have been faster." I couldn't say back except, for years I tried to forget that day, to bury the memory of being underwater with my lungs screaming. Sometimes late at night it comes back. The waiting, the silence, the realization that someone can smile while they're hurting you. Connor never apologized, never admitted it. And the worst part was learning something I wish I hadn't. Monsters don't live under your bed. They live next door. I never imagined a tiny rental could feel like a gift, but after what happened at my old place, it did. The apartment before this one literally came apart. The ceiling in an upstairs unit caved in and the city condemned the whole building overnight. We were given a week to get out, 7 days to salvage our lives. I shoved what I could into boxes, left the rest, and spent the next few weeks floating between my brother's couch and Daniel's house while I tried to figure out something more permanent. Daniel had only been in the house on the edge of Oakage for a couple of months. Weathered clapboard, 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, floorboards so old they complained with each step. It wasn't anything special, but it was tidy, quiet, and there was a big backyard shaded by two huge maples. The catch was the yard was shared. There was another almost identical house a few feet away, separated only by a strip of grass. Same landlord, same rent. No fence, no hedge. When we moved in, the other place was empty. For about a week, we had the yard to ourselves, and it felt like an extra room. Then the U-Haul came. It was a Saturday morning. I was at the kitchen window with my coffee when they climbed down. A man, tall, broad, late 30s, his gray tee dark with sweat. A woman with her long, dark hair twisted into a knot, her face sharp and a little hollow like she hadn't slept in days. A girl of 15, maybe 16, hood up even though it was warm, earbuds buried in. They hauled box after box, furniture scraping the door frames. Later, a younger guy showed up, mid-20s, scruffy, cap low. He didn't carry anything. He hung back on the porch, smoking, scanning the street like he was taking inventory. I leaned toward Daniel and said, "Looks like we've got company." He came to the window, squinted, then shrugged. "Marcus and Claire," he said after introducing himself. "Their daughter's Lily, that other Dean. Claire says he's family." "Family?" I echoed, and Daniel just said, "That's what she said." For a week they kept to themselves. Marcus waved from a distance. Claire gave the kind of tight smile people use to close a conversation. Lily lived in her phone. Dean was always outside, leaning on the rail, cigarette between his fingers, eyes that slid over the neighborhood and never settled. We told ourselves that was all it was. People have habits. People have odd edges. Then the noises started. The first night it was a thread of sound, thin and strange, drifting from their open window while Daniel and I sat outside with beers. The air smelled like cut grass and something in me eased. Then something else slipped in, low voices, muffled thumps like a movie at first. Then a moan that wasn't the kind you hear in films but raw and ragged, all breath and push. My face flushed hot. Daniel glanced at me, a half smile on his lips. "Guess they're breaking the place in," he muttered, but even his voice had an edge. It grew louder, clearer. You could hear the strain, the abruptness, the small sharp sounds between the breaths. I laughed to cover the way my stomach tightened, and we shut the windows, told ourselves to sleep. 2 nights later, I woke to something that was not sleep's afterimage. A mechanical scream. It cut through the house, harsh, grinding. I sat up, pulse stuttering. A chainsaw. For one surreal second, I thought I'd imagined it. The second rev made the glass tremble. I stumbled out of bed, and Daniel was already at the window, hand pressed to the frame. His voice was small, controlled. "It's coming from next door." I edged beside him, pulled the curtain just enough to peer out. The yard was a black hole except for an orange flicker from their windows. Inside, shadows shredded themselves across the rooms, jerking, frantic silhouettes that didn't look like ordinary people moving in a house. Then the scream cut the night, thin, high, human. Daniel swore and grabbed his phone. "I'm calling the cops," he said. I gripped his arm. "Don't go over there." He hesitated, jaw tight, then nodded and dialed. He told the dispatcher everything in a clipped rush. Chainsaw, screaming, possible violence. They said they'd send someone. We waited. No lights, no sirens. Morning looked ordinary. Marcus was out with a rake. Claire sipped coffee on the porch. Lily scrolled her phone like nothing had happened. When Daniel asked about the noise, Marcus laughed. "Chainsaw?" I was asleep. "Maybe a TV." I didn't believe him. 3 days later, I nearly stopped in the street. Claire was sweeping the patio, moving the broom in slow, lazy arcs, wearing only gray sweatpants. No shirt. For a second, I thought my eyes were wrong. She stood bare to the waist in the morning sun, her pale skin almost bright, treating exposure like ordinary behavior. She looked up and smiled. Not warm, but slow and curling in a way that made my stomach flip. I said nothing and drove away. That night I told Daniel. He gave a nervous laugh, maybe drunk, maybe trying to sound light. Then the noises returned. Not moans, but stomping. Heavy, deliberate steps paced back and forth until our floorboards vibrated. It had a cadence like someone marking time. Underneath came murmurs, low, guttural, not quite words. "Chanting?" Daniel snapped, voice tight. The next afternoon he marched over while I watched from the porch, heart in my throat. Marcus opened the door wearing that easy grin. Claire hovered behind him with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Daniel didn't waste time. "Listen, whatever you're doing at 2 in the morning, knock it off. We can hear everything." Marcus blinked and laughed. "We were asleep, man." Think it was a raccoon? Claire made a thin, high giggle that crawled under my skin. Daniel came back furious. They're lying. I believed him. Then everything went wrong. Saturday evening, I was rinsing dishes when I looked up and froze. Claire lay by their fire pit, motionless, lit by the flames. At first, I thought she was sunbathing. Then I saw the wrong angle of her arm. Too still. "Daniel!" I shouted as I ran out. She wasn't breathing, no pulse. Old CPR training returned like muscle memory, and I started compressions, shouting for him to call 911. When the paramedics arrived, the world blurred into frantic motion. They rushed inside and found Marcus, Dean, and Lily collapsed and barely conscious, curled together in a corner. The air that spilled from the house was wrong, chemical and metallic, thick with something that made my throat close. Later we learned the cause: carbon monoxide. Their windows had been painted shut for years. No detectors, no ventilation. They had almost died. They never came back. Now Daniel has had our place tested. I can't sleep without imagining that invisible gas filling our lungs. Carbon monoxide explains much: confusion, disorientation, odd behavior. But not everything. What about the chanting and the ritual stomping? What about the night we swore a chainsaw revved through the dark? When the wind shifts just right, sometimes I still hear it. And I wonder if something else ever lived in that house. Something patient, waiting to seep through the walls. Police came later to take statements. Their faces were polite but tired. The kind who have heard too many stories that don't add up. An inspector pried the painted windows and frowned. The landlord shuffled papers and promised repairs. At the hospital, Marcus, Dean, and Lily were dazed, words slow, eyes unfocused. Daniel stopped sleeping. He checked the hallways at night with a flashlight and watched the dark toward the empty house without speaking. I replayed the sound, the rev, the measured stomps, that high giggle, until they overlapped with the memory of my old ceiling collapsing. Now I sleep with a carbon monoxide detector clipped to the outlet and a harder distrust of slow smiles now. I was 20 when it all began, and even now I wish I'd trusted that first gnawing twist in my gut. Back then, life finally seemed to be moving forward. After years of slogging through high school in a town that felt like it was slowly dying, I'd been accepted to a college out of state. Not a dream school, nothing glamorous, but far enough from home that I could finally breathe, start over, figure out who I was meant to be. Money, though, was always a shadow over my plans. My financial aid covered tuition and books, but rent and living expenses? That was on me. Dorms were impossibly expensive. For a while, I thought I'd have to defer my acceptance. But after endless late-night calls with my parents, careful budgeting, and a few compromises, we scraped together enough to rent a small one-bedroom house just off campus. It wasn't much. The floors groaned with every step like brittle bones protesting. The kitchen tiles were chipped, and the yard had clearly been ignored for years. But it was mine. Quiet, cheap, and at least on paper safe. Or so I thought. The street had that quiet, settled vibe of a neighborhood past its prime. Most of the houses belonged to retirees or couples in their late 50s and 60s. They weren't unfriendly, just distant, except for one person. 2 doors down lived Mr. Adler. I'd guess he was in his late 50s, early 60s. Thin gray hair, always a faded polo tucked into jeans. The sort of man you'd pass without a second thought. He appeared almost immediately after I moved in, his dog trotting beside him. "Morning," he said, flashing a smile that felt oddly practiced. Hey," I muttered, juggling a box from my car to the house, sweat running down my back. "New neighbor, huh? Good to have some young blood around here. Streets have been getting quiet lately," he added, laughing softly, like he'd shared a private joke with himself. "Yeah, just moved in for school," I said, shifting the box. He glanced at the stacked boxes on my porch. "Need a hand?" "I'm good, thanks," I said, thinking that should have been the end of it, just polite neighborly banter. But Mr. Adler wasn't like other neighbors. At first, his presence seemed harmless, knocking every morning, wishing me a good day before I headed to class. I didn't think much of it at first. Pleasantries, a wave, done, but soon it started to feel different. His conversations lingered, stretched on too long. He'd ask about my classes, where I was from, if I had family nearby. Each question peeled at me in a way that left me exposed. One morning I muttered, "Sorry, I'm running late." And without warning, He fell into step beside me, walking toward campus. At first, I laughed it off. Maybe he was lonely, right? But then a creeping unease settled in. When I slowed, he slowed. When I sped up, he matched my pace. No matter how brief my answers, he kept talking. About the weather, how quiet the neighborhood was at night, how I couldn't trust everyone on campus. It went on for nearly 2 weeks before I finally managed, as politely as I could. Look, Mr. Adler, I really appreciate your kindness, but my schedule's tight. Maybe just a quick wave in the mornings. For a long moment, he didn't respond. His smile wavered, and the intensity of his gaze made the hairs on my neck rise. Then he nodded slowly. Of course, he said quietly. Wouldn't want to bother you. But the way he said it, the softness, the pause, the tiny dip of his head made my stomach tighten in a knot I couldn't shake. After that, he vanished. No more knocks, no more walks alongside me to class. For the first time in weeks, I finally felt like I could breathe. Life returned to a dull, predictable rhythm. Classes, friends, late-night study sessions fueled by way too much coffee. Occasionally, I'd glance toward his house while walking past, but the curtains were always drawn, the lawn empty. I told myself he'd gotten the message, until that Wednesday night. Around 11, I was hunched over my laptop, flashcards scattered across the bed and desk, caffeine coursing through me as midterms loomed. Then I heard it, a soft tap at the window. At first, I dismissed it as a branch scraping in the wind, but it came again, tap, tap. My curtains were drawn, blocking the view. The next tap came harder. My stomach dropped. I stood slowly, heart hammering, and yanked the curtains aside. There he was, Mr. Adler, standing in my driveway, motionless. No dog, no wave, no expression that made sense. Just stillness. His eyes locked on mine, unblinking. I froze. Breath caught in my throat, my hands trembling. For what felt like hours, we just stared at each other through the glass. Then, almost without thinking, I slammed the curtain shut, killed the lights, and double-checked every lock on every door and window. The silence afterward was suffocating. Morning came, the sun creeping over the rooftops, and the street was empty. No sign of him. I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe he was drunk, maybe hallucinating, maybe my stress-addled mind was playing tricks. But the image of him standing there, silent and statuesque, refused to fade. I forced myself to go to class, even lingered on campus longer than usual, trying to shake the unease. By the time I walked back home that evening, the sky was bruised with sunset, and that's when I saw the chaos. 3 police cars, an ambulance, lights flashing red and blue across the street. My steps turned to a jog, then froze completely as I saw him, Mr. Adler, handcuffed, being led to a cruiser. What happened? My voice was trembling. The nearest officer looked at me, eyes wary. You live here? Yeah. What's going on? He hesitated, glancing toward the house. A meter reader came onto your property this afternoon. Legally, they can check the utility meters, even in the basement. When he went inside, your neighbor was waiting. Attacked him. Kitchen knife. My stomach dropped like a stone. What? The officer's jaw tightened. Looks like your neighbor broke in hours ago. Probably waiting for you to return. I felt my face go pale, my hands numb. My kitchen knife, my house. How close I had been to becoming part of something unthinkable. The only reason the meter reader survived was because someone in the neighborhood saw Adler slip through a back window and called it in. The cops arrived just in time. Within days, I was moved to a different rental. The college reimbursed my parents, probably to avoid a lawsuit. And Mr. Adler? Somewhere in a cell facing attempted murder, breaking and entering God knows what else. Months have passed, yet some nights I still wake up, imagining that soft, deliberate tap on the glass. And every time the same chilling thought hits me. What would have happened if the meter reader hadn't come first? I was 28 when I signed the last paper and slid the keys into my pocket, the metal cold and heavy against my palm. My first house, small, neat, with a backyard that caught the last of the afternoon sun just right. It sat at the edge of a quiet little neighborhood called Willow Creek, tucked behind a row of maples that swayed gently in the evening breeze. It wasn't the biggest or the flashiest house I could have bought, not the kind with floor-to-ceiling windows or a granite island in the kitchen, but it was mine, and that meant everything. I'd spent most of my 20s grinding in the entertainment industry, running the chaos behind the cameras for influencers, social media personalities, and even a few names that, at one point, I swore I'd only ever see in magazines. The hours were insane, the stress relentless, and the paychecks, though generous, always came at a cost. Late nights spent reading contracts, early mornings juggling schedules, trying to keep egos from colliding. It was a grind. But now, standing in the empty living room, key in hand, I could finally say I earned something that didn't feel borrowed or temporary. It was just me and Milo now. Milo, my enormous snow-white dogo Argentino, a walking wall of muscle, teeth sharp enough to turn a home invasion into a crime scene. But he was more than that. He was family, guardian, and my shadow through the hardest years. That first night, I watched him sprawled across the hardwood floor, chest rising and falling in slow, steady breaths. He lifted his head and gave me that look, the one dark, unwavering gaze that somehow made the chaos of the world feel distant. I felt my chest unclench for the first time in years. The first week passed in a haze of unpacking boxes, tightening loose cabinet handles, and memorizing the location of light switches. Most neighbors kept to themselves, polite waves exchanged over hedges or from driveways. Normal, safe. After years in LA, constantly running on fumes, I craved exactly that. On the third day, I met her. I was hauling a box marked kitchen from the trunk when a voice floated behind me, soft and lilting, like someone who spent Sunday afternoons baking pies for strangers. New in town? I turned. A woman, maybe in her late 60s, with silver hair pinned neatly into a bun, stood there. Her cardigan was the muted pink of dried roses, and she carried a Tupperware container with a proud, unassuming smile. "I'm Brenda," she said, stepping closer. "I live just up the street. Figured I'd stop by and welcome you properly." I wiped my hands on my jeans and returned the smile. "Appreciate that." "I'm Noah." She held out the container. Inside were sugar cookies. Perfect little rounds dusted with fine sugar, the kind that smelled like warmth in Sunday mornings. "Been making these for years," she said. "Everyone's probably tired of them by now." I laughed, accepting them. "Thanks. That's really kind of you." Milo, ever curious, patted over and sniffed at her shoes. She bent slightly, fingers brushing over his head, smiling down at him. "Oh, he's a big boy, isn't he?" "Gorgeous." "Yeah," I said, grinning. "His name's Milo. He's friendly most of the time." She chuckled, straightened, and waved gently. "Well, Noah, welcome to Willow Creek. If you ever need sugar, milk, or someone to keep an eye on your place, don't hesitate to ask." We chatted a few more minutes before she turned to walk back up the street, leaving me with a rare sense of warmth. Genuine kindness, I realized, was scarce. That night, I set the cookies on the counter. I wasn't much of a sweets person, and Milo certainly didn't care for them, so I figured I'd take them to work the next day. No sense wasting someone's goodwill. By Friday, the house felt lived in enough to host a small gathering. A couple of old friends, the ones who stuck around through the broke years when dinner often meant cup noodles and ambition, were coming over. I grabbed a few beers, ordered wings, and by 9 o'clock, the living room hummed with laughter and the distant commentary of a football game on TV. Milo lay stretched out by the couch, head resting on his paws, eyes tracking us like an invisible scoreboard. Every so often a low whimper escaped him, soft, almost imperceptible, but enough to draw my attention. "You good, buddy?" I asked, crouching to scratch behind his ears. His tail thumped once against the floor, then he turned his head, avoiding my gaze. I frowned. That was odd. Milo wasn't the dramatic type. Never had been. But half an hour into the evening, I noticed it again. He was restless, shifting from standing to sitting to lying down and back again over and over, his chest heaving heavier than usual. My brow furrowed. "Yo, you okay, man?" James asked, nodding toward Milo, his beer balanced precariously in his hand. I don't know. "He's acting weird," I muttered, glancing down at my dog, trying to brush off the gnawing worry creeping up my spine. "You feed him something different?" James prompted, frowning. "No," I started, then froze mid-word. My eyes darted to the kitchen counter. "The plate?" My heart thumped against my ribs like a frantic drum. I shot up so fast my beer teetered and nearly spilled. The counter was empty, gone. Only a chewed-up shard of plastic lay on the floor, dusted with sugar crumbs. My stomach pitched. I muttered under my breath, voice tight, throat dry. "What?" James asked, leaning forward. "The cookies," I croaked, pointing at the mess. The ones that sweet elderly woman had brought me just days ago. James blinked. What about them? Milo's guilty slobber-covered face was explanation enough. He had eaten them, all of them, half a dozen at least, maybe more. James cursed quietly. His girlfriend, a vet tech, had been on FaceTime with him earlier that evening. We called her immediately, my hands trembling as I held the phone. The second she heard the story, her voice snapped. No softness, no hesitation. Get him to an emergency vet now, don't wait. "Cuz," I didn't argue. James and I lifted Milo into the backseat of my car, his massive frame trembling, jowls drooling, pupils blown wide with fear. Every second stretched into eternity. I slammed the accelerator down, gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles went bone white, heart hammering like a war drum. At the clinic, they whisked him away instantly. The antiseptic burned my nose and I sank into a plastic chair. Fingers laced together to hide how much they shook. An hour crawled by before the vet emerged, her expression taut, careful. "Mr. Parker?" I sprang to my feet. She nodded, slow. "He's stable, for now." But it was close. "Your dog ingested a high concentration of brafacum." I blinked. "But brafacum?" "Rodenticide," she said, her voice clipped. "Super warfarin. It's used to kill large pests, possums, rats. In dogs, even a small amount can cause internal bleeding, organ failure. We've started treatment, but he wouldn't have made it through the night otherwise." My legs went weak. I gripped the edge of the chair as if it could hold me upright. "Wait, are you saying the cookies?" She gave me a hard nod, mouth pressed into a thin line. I left the clinic hours later with Milo hooked up to an IV, his massive body trembling under the sterile blankets. My mind spun in a fog of rage, confusion, and fear. Who did this? Who handed out poison like a gift? A friendly gesture wrapped in sugar. The police came the next day, taking my statement down to every detail. Her name, her appearance, what she wore. They canvassed the neighborhood, knocking on doors. No one knew her. Not a single neighbor had ever heard of a Brenda living on our street. Weeks passed. Milo finally came home, tail wagging as though nothing had happened. But I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me. The sudden spike of adrenaline at every crunch of gravel outside. She never came back. But sometimes when Milo and I walk after dark, I swear I catch a glimpse of her at the far end of the street. Cardigan swaying in the wind, standing there, just watching. Always watching. I didn't plan on living alone. Honestly, if you'd asked me 2 years ago, I would have laughed in disbelief. The very thought of silence used to terrify me. I grew up in a house that never stopped. 3 siblings, a couple of dogs, the TV always blaring, arguments ricocheting down the hallway. Chaos wasn't just normal. It was comforting. So when I hit 27 and decided I needed my own place, the quiet felt like a physical shock. The first few nights I kept waking up convinced I'd missed some sound, some warning. But slowly I started to adjust. Work helped distract me. 60-hour weeks at a logistics firm meant I didn't have much time to dwell, and saving up gave me a sense of purpose. When I finally signed the lease for a small 1-bedroom in the east wing of Briarwood Apartments, I swear it felt like I'd actually accomplished something. Not luxury, not even close. The carpet was thin, like walking on a sponge. The drywall so cheap it seemed like a strong push could create a hole, and the plumbing groaned like a wheezing old man every time I flushed. But it was mine. I bought a thrifted couch, strung a few pictures on the walls, and set up a TV that was slightly bigger than necessary. For the first time in years, I felt stable. The neighbors were quiet, which suited me. Mostly older folks, people who chain-smoked on their patios or shuffled to their cars with grocery bags hanging from both arms. Friendly in a nod and wave kind of way, nothing more. Morning, I'd call. A smile. Maybe a quick, how's it going? But no one lingered. That peace lasted nearly 9 months, predictable, comfortable. And then Eli moved in next door. I first noticed him on a Wednesday morning in early June. I was already late for work when I found my Honda blocked by a moving truck. I jogged up, rapping my knuckles against the cab window. The driver jumped, pointing behind him toward a tall, thin man hauling boxes. "Hey, man," I said, trying for casual, keeping my voice steady even as my pulse went haywire. "Could you move this real quick? I've got to get to work." The man turned. His eyes met mine, and God, it felt like ice crawling down my spine. No smile, no acknowledgement, just a stare that lingered just a beat too long. Then, almost in a whisper, "I'll be done soon." That was it. No apology, no nod, just that calm, eerie statement. I forced a laugh. Sure, no rush, just whenever. And I left it alone. The truck was gone a couple of hours later. Eli disappeared too, as far as I could tell. His blinds stayed shut for the rest of that week. No sound, no sign of life. If I hadn't heard the occasional thud through the wall, I would have assumed the place was empty. By the second week, the small unease I'd felt the first day began to grow. The first hint came with a smell, subtle, almost unnoticeable, but wrong. Like singed paper mixed with melted plastic. Curiosity gnawed at me one evening and I slid my patio door open. There he was. Eli crouched over a metal bucket, flames licking upward as he fed it strips of paper. Not junk mail, thick pages torn from something significant, maybe a book or a journal. His posture wasn't careless or bored. He was deliberate, devoted, like a priest performing some ritual in the dead of night. I froze. His head lifted slowly, our eyes locked, glass-sharp, unnervingly calm. Without a word, he placed a lid over the bucket, snuffing the fire, still holding my gaze, and then turned and went inside. That night, sleep was a stranger. I told myself it was normal, people burn old bills, tax forms, but the uneasy knot in my stomach didn't fade. A few nights later, around 2 a.m, I woke to a sound I can still hear if I close my eyes. Scrappy, pause, scrappy, slow, heavy like metal dragged inch by inch across tile, from his side of the wall. I sat up, holding my breath, waiting for it to end. 10 minutes passed, then silence. I started writing things down, not because I thought he was dangerous, not yet, but something in me whispered, "Pay attention. You'll need this later." The escalation came with the SUV. I got home late from work to find a matte black Suburban parked in the visitor spot. Tinted windows so dark they were opaque. No plates. 2 men stepped out, matching suits, buzzed hair, military posture. They didn't knock. They didn't talk. Just disappeared into Eli's apartment like they owned the place. Muffled voices, occasional thumps, then silence again. I told myself it wasn't my business. That reasoning doesn't survive long in a human brain. You notice things. You remember. And my gut screamed that something was very, very wrong. It gnaws at you, the unanswered questions. The next morning, I ran into Eli by the mailboxes and tried to act casual. "Hey, settling in okay?" I asked, forcing lightness into my voice. He didn't look up, just muttered, "Fine." I laughed, nervous. "Saw some friends of yours last night. Security team, family?" That's when he stopped walking. Turned his head slowly like a hinge and fixed me with a stare that made my chest tighten. When he spoke, his voice was flat, almost academic in its detachment. "You should mind your own business. Not anger, not a threat, just final, like gravity." After that, I stopped trying to make eye contact. I bought a cheap dash cam, angled it toward his walkway, and recorded every time that SUV showed up. 3 visits in 2 weeks, each after midnight. Then nothing. Weeks of silence. His blinds stayed closed. No lights, no smell of burning, no dragging. I almost convinced myself he'd moved out, until the night of the McLaren. I was sitting down with a microwaved dinner when headlights cut across my living room wall. Low, sleek, expensive. My stomach flipped. A silver McLaren purred into the lot. 2 people stepped out, perfectly dressed, as if on their way to a gala. The man's blazer was navy, tailored sharp. His jaw looked like it could slice bread. The woman's heels clicked against the concrete like gunfire. They glided straight to Eli's door. He opened it before they knocked. This time it wasn't quiet. Voices rose, male furious, female icy and cutting. Eli's deeper tone remained calm. Too calm, like he was holding back a storm. Then suddenly silence again. The 3 of them walked out smiling like nothing had happened and drove away. That was the last time I ever saw Eli alive. A few days later, the smell returned. Sour, rotting like meat left out in July heat. I reported it to the building manager. They said someone would come. Nobody did. Saturday evening, I came home to flashing lights, 2 cruisers, an unmarked black sedan, an ambulance. Yellow tape cordoned off Eli's door. Crime scene techs knelt by the patio, clipboards in hand. One of the suited men from before stood off to the side, arms crossed, face unreadable. I hovered at the edge of the lot until a cop approached. "You live nearby?" "Next door," I said. "Been smelling something for days." "Well, that was probably him," the officer said flatly. "Deceased at least a week. I spilled everything, the fires, the dragging, the SUV visits, the McLaren couple. He jotted notes, nodded like none of it surprised him. Then he said, "We're not treating this as a homicide. No forced entry, no visible trauma. Probably natural causes." I stared. Natural causes? After all that, these things happen, he shrugged. Weird guy, weird life doesn't always equal foul play. They zipped up the body bag, loaded it into the ambulance. That night I sat in the dark, staring at the wall we'd shared, haunted by a detail I hadn't told the cop. The last time I saw Eli after the couple left, I caught a flash through his sliding door. A metal table bolted to the floor, thick canvas straps hanging from the sides, dark at the buckles. When the cleaning crew came Monday, they hauled out boxes, ripped up carpet. But when they left for lunch, I peeked through the patio. The table was still there, tarp covering it, straps dangling, grooves in the floor beneath it. They weren't from one piece of furniture. Years of dragging. They never moved that table. I don't know what became of it. A week later, a black SUV rolled through again. 5 a.m., no cops, no lights. Parked for an hour, then drove away. I tried to look Eli up online. No last name, no records, nothing. Like he'd never existed. Months passed. Eventually, a young couple moved in, strung fairy lights on the patio, brought home a baby. Nice people, normal life. But on warm nights, when their patio door is cracked, I sometimes hear it through the wall. Scrappy. Pause. Scrappy. And I wonder if they know what they're living on top of. I was 23 when I made the decision to leave the city behind. After college, I needed space. A real break from the constant hum of noise, the never-ending traffic jams, and the way people brushed past each other without a single glance. My head was cluttered with ideas for a book I'd been plotting for over 2 years, but I could never find the kind of silence necessary to hear my own thoughts. So, when I stumbled across a listing for an old lakeside house in Hollow Creek, a tiny town 2 hours from the nearest city, I jumped on it immediately. The photos showed a weathered 2-story home, its white paint chipped and peeling, a wraparound porch sagging just enough to look inviting, and a backdrop of endless trees. The ad promised perfect solitude for creatives, and included a note about the area's timeless, inspiring beauty. That was exactly what I needed. I arrived in late August when the air still clung to the warmth of summer but carried the faint whisper of autumn in the breeze. The road wound through dense forest before finally opening up to a dark lake, its surface shimmering under the fading sun. My rental sat right on the water's edge, encircled by tall pines, the gravel driveway crunching sharply beneath my tires. The house was bigger than I expected. 2 floors, 3 bedrooms, a sagging porch swing that rocked slightly in the wind, and windows that reflected the orange glow of sunset like dull, unblinking eyes. A narrow path led toward the woods at the back, and through the trees I could make out what looked like a low stone wall. I grabbed my suitcase and climbed the porch steps. The front door groaned as I opened it, and the smell of old wood mixed with a faint metallic tang hit me immediately. On the kitchen counter, a note leaned against a jar of sugar. "Welcome, Ian. Groceries are stocked. Heat works. If you need anything, call me. Mara." A phone number was scribbled beneath. The fridge was already stocked with milk, eggs, and leftover fried chicken. Someone had even left a small basket of fruit. It felt almost too welcoming. I shook the thought away. I chose the largest bedroom upstairs, dropped my suitcase, and stretched. The window looked out over the lake, now silver under the rising moon. Perfect view for writing, I thought. That's when I saw it. Hanging from the ceiling beam like some grotesque ornament was a bat, big, black, wings folded tight, tiny claws hooked into the wood. Jesus Christ, my voice cracked. It twitched, but it didn't move. Its beady eyes glinted in the dim light like whetstones. My heart started hammering, and I backed out of the room, fumbling for my phone. I dialed the number on Mara's note. She answered on the second ring. "Hello?" There's a bat in my bedroom," I blurted, my voice tighter than I wanted it to be. A pause. Then a soft chuckle. That happens sometimes. We're close to the lake. What do I do? Close the door. It'll probably find its way out through the vent or the attic. If not, I can come by tomorrow with a net. I stared at the closed door like it might suddenly burst open. "You're serious?" I asked, voice shaky. "It won't "It won't hurt you unless you grab it," she said calmly. "Sleep in another room tonight." I wanted to argue, but the exhaustion from the 3-hour drive weighed me down. Fine. Guest room it was. By morning, the bat was gone. I opened the bedroom door slowly, heart thudding, and scanned the ceiling. Empty. The only trace left behind was a scattering of dust on the floorboards. Relieved, I made coffee and stepped onto the porch. The lake lay calm, mist curling over its surface. The air was sharp and clean. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. That's when I saw him. A man stood near the tree line across the narrow gravel road. Tall and lean, dressed in black slacks and a dark shirt despite the lingering warmth, hands shoved into his pockets. His face was hard to read from this distance, but the stillness of his posture made the hairs on my arms rise. When he noticed me staring, he raised one pale hand and gave a slow wave. I hesitated, then returned a small wave. He didn't move, just lingered a moment longer before turning and disappearing silently into the woods. I officially met him that evening. After a full day of unpacking and scribbling ideas for my book, I decided to stretch my legs and walk off the cabin fever. The gravel road behind the house wound lazily toward the hills. The air had cooled, crickets had begun their evening chorus, and the sky was streaked in shades of rust and violet, promising a quiet, eerie night. I'd gone maybe half a mile down the gravel road when I heard it, footsteps crunching behind me, deliberate and slow. "Evening," a voice said, smooth and deep, cutting through the chorus of crickets. I froze, my stomach tightening. Slowly I turned. There he was, the man from the woods. Up close he looked off. Not ugly, not even unpleasant. Just wrong in a way that creeps under your skin if you stare too long. His skin was pale, almost gray in the dying light. Cheekbones sharp, lips thin and bloodless. But his eyes, those eyes made my chest tighten, a washed-out gray, nearly colorless, framed by lashes so dark they almost seemed unreal. "You're the new guy," he said, not a question. Yeah. "Ian," I replied, forcing casualness, my voice sounding small to my own ears. He smiled faintly, just enough to reveal perfectly straight teeth. Too perfect. Victor Hale, I live across the lake." "Nice to meet you," I said, trying not to glance past him at the trees. "Do you like it here so far?" His voice was soft, deliberate in a way that made each word linger. "Yeah. Peaceful." "Peaceful can be good," I said. "Or very lonely," he countered, his eyes unblinking, fixed somewhere beyond the shadows creeping along the road. We walked in silence for a while, my boots crunching on the gravel while his steps made no sound at all. Then abruptly he asked, "Do you believe in the dead, Ian?" I let out a short, nervous laugh. "What?" "The dead," he repeated, tilting his head slightly, unnervingly human in gesture, yet somehow not. "Those who linger when they shouldn't. Creatures that live in darkness, craving warmth." "You mean ghosts?" I asked cautiously. His lips twitched into something that wasn't quite a smile, something far older and sharper than humor. I stared at him, uneasy. "You're talking about vampires," I said quietly. "Do you believe in them?" "No," I answered quickly, too quickly. "Those are stories. Legends." "Stories often have roots in truth," he murmured, glancing toward the thickening shadows. "Careful walking these roads after dusk." Before I could respond, he gave an oddly formal nod as if parting were a ritual, and slipped silently into the trees, disappearing like smoke. That night I dreamed of wings. Cold wind lashed my face. The leathery slap of movement surrounded me, whispers curling around my ears like smoke. I woke drenched in sweat, the darkness pressing against me. Something shifted above. I looked up and froze. The bat was back, clinging to the ceiling fan, its greenish eyes glowing faintly in the dark. I didn't move. My breath hitched, then it lunged, teeth bared, aiming for my face. Instinct took over. I grabbed the bedside lamp and swung. Glass shattered. The bat screeched and vanished. Gone. Through the window, I was certain I'd locked. Heart pounding, I stumbled to the porch, sucking in night air. The lake lay black and silent. Across the water, near the tree line, a figure stood watching. Victor, motionless. The next morning, chaos erupted outside. Voices shouted. I pulled on a hoodie and stepped onto the porch just as a group of locals passed. carrying something on a makeshift stretcher. A body, Victor's body, his head at an unnatural angle, dark hair matted with blood. What happened? I called out. One of the men looked at me, shrugging. Fell from a tree. Poor bastard, split his skull on a rock. Always was a little odd. They moved on, leaving a trail of red drops on the gravel. I stood frozen, relief and unease twisting inside me. That night I double-locked every door and window, sat up writing until exhaustion dragged me under. Around 3 a.m, I woke to scratching at the glass, and slow, deliberate. My heart thundered in my chest. I turned toward the window, and there he was. Victor. Skin waxy, lips pulled back in a grin that revealed teeth too long, too sharp. His eyes glowed like coals in the dark. A whisper slipped through the glass, curling into the room like smoke. I told you. The dead don't always stay buried. The lock clicked. The window creaked open, and the room filled with wings.